The Highway of Tears, the unsolved murders and disappearances in Canada. The Highway of Tears refers to a 725-kilometer stretch of Highway 16 in British Columbia, Canada, where a series of unsolved murders and disappearances of mainly Indigenous women and girls have occurred since 1969. Despite decades of investigations, many of the cases remain unsolved, and the killers are still at large. The stretch of road has become a haunting symbol of the violence inflicted on Indigenous communities and the systemic failure to provide justice for the victims. The disappearances and murders. The official number of victims linked to the Highway of Tears ranges from 18 to more than 40, depending on different reports. The women who disappeared along the highway were often last seen hitchhiking, as many lacked access to reliable transportation in the remote and rural areas of northern British Columbia. The victims of the Highway of Tears were predominantly young Indigenous women, a group that is disproportionately affected by violence and murder in Canada. Many of the women disappeared without a trace, and their bodies were found in remote areas, often months or years later. Some were murdered, while others simply vanished, never to be seen again. The first known victim, 26-year-old Gloria Moody, was found murdered near Williams Lake, British Columbia, in 1969. Over the following decades, the number of victims continued to rise, with many of the cases sharing similar characteristics: young women, often hitchhiking or traveling alone, disappearing along the stretch of Highway 16. The investigation. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP, launched several investigations into the disappearances and murders over the years, but the cases proved difficult to solve due to the remote locations, the lack of witnesses, and the often scant evidence left behind. In 2005, the RCMP formed a special task force, Project EPANA, to investigate the growing number of unsolved murders and disappearances along the highway. The task force initially focused on 9 cases that occurred between 1989 and 2006, but as the investigation progressed, the scope expanded to include more cases from the 1970s and 1980s. Despite these efforts, the majority of the cases remain unsolved, and families of the victims have expressed frustration at the lack of progress. Many have criticized law enforcement for not taking the cases seriously enough in the early years, particularly given the high percentage of Indigenous victims. Suspects and theories. Over the years, several suspects have emerged in connection to the Highway of Tears cases, but none have been definitively linked to all of the disappearances and murders. Investigators have considered the possibility that more than one serial killer may be responsible, given the long span of time and the number of victims. One of the main suspects is Bobby Jack Fowler, an American drifter and convicted murderer, who was linked to the 1974 murder of 16-year-old Colleen McMillan after his DNA was found on her remains. Fowler, who died in prison in 2006, is also suspected in other unsolved cases, but investigators have been unable to connect him to all of the Highway of Tears murders. Another suspect, Cody Legerbokoff, was convicted of the murders of 4 women in northern British Columbia between 2009 and 2010. While Legerbokoff was too young to be responsible for the earlier murders along the highway, his crimes raised concerns about a possible connection to some of the more recent cases. Some theories suggest that multiple killers may be responsible for the Highway of Tears deaths, with each case being independent of the others. Others believe that the victims were targeted by human traffickers or predators who exploited the vulnerability of women traveling alone in rural areas. The impact on Indigenous communities. The Highway of Tears case highlights the systemic violence faced by Indigenous women in Canada, a population that is 5 times more likely to experience violence than non-Indigenous women. The lack of infrastructure, such as public transportation, has left many women reliant on hitchhiking to get to work, school, or visit family members, putting them at increased risk. Indigenous leaders and advocates have long called for more attention to be paid to the disappearances and murders of Indigenous women, not only along the Highway of Tears but across Canada. The cases have become a focal point for a broader movement to address the high rates of violence, murder, and sexual assault faced by Indigenous women and girls. In 2015, the Canadian government launched a national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, MIWG, to investigate the systemic causes of violence against Indigenous women, and make recommendations for addressing the crisis. The inquiry's final report, released in 2019, called for sweeping reforms to improve safety, policing, and justice for Indigenous women. The ongoing search for justice despite efforts by law enforcement and the Canadian government, the Highway of Tears remains an open wound, with many families of the victims still waiting for answers. For many, the unsolved cases are a painful reminder of the lack of justice for Indigenous women and girls, whose disappearances and murders often go unnoticed or unsolved. In recent years, awareness campaigns and memorials have been organized to honor the victims and bring attention to the ongoing crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women. Still, the lack of concrete answers and the continued disappearances along the highway make it clear that the threat remains. The killer still at large to this day. Many of the murders and disappearances along the Highway of Tears remain unsolved, and the killers responsible for these heinous crimes have yet to be brought to justice. The vast and isolated terrain of northern British Columbia, combined with a lack of infrastructure and resources, has made it difficult to track down suspects or gather sufficient evidence. Families continue to hold out hope that advancements in forensic technology or new leads will one day lead to answers. Until then, the Highway of Tears remains one of Canada's most haunting and unresolved criminal mysteries.